I'm now going to tackle world religions, just to go through the basics of all world religions, principally to show how they're all connected to Druidism. We start here with Genesis, an alternative translation by Christian O'Brien. And his translation of Genesis 1 is as follows. In the beginning, the Elohim created the heavens and earth. Now, the word Elohim, which is the word for God used in the Bible, is a plural word, and it should be translated as the shining ones. El means bright. Elohim is bright people. And so he made these small changes in the translation. Genesis 1:26, the Shining One said, let us make man in our image, in the likeness of ourselves. Genesis 2:8, Yahweh, the leader of the Shining Ones, planted a garden in Eden, which is in the east. And Genesis 5:24, Enoch walked with the Shining Ones. Then he disappeared because the Shining Ones took him away. So it's very important that when we look at this word God, it really, in its earliest form, is the Elohim. There's an explanation of that in the St. James's Bible, saying we know it's a plural word, but it's God's majesty is plural. The Old Testament does not tell us specifically who or what these shining ones were, but fortunately the ancient Sumerian records do, and also certain alternative Hebrew documents which are not well understood by biblical scholars. We're going to go into the O'Brien work, which explains and gives us all these wonderful records about the greatest story ever told, about who we are, where we came from, and who our gods were, and what they've done for us, and how benevolent they were. Here is the Sumerian account in the beginning, and this is an extract, archaic cuneiform, from the Karsag epics featured in the Genius of the Few by Christian and Barbara Joy O'Brien. And you've got two signs here. One on the left is Gar, which means an irrigated enclosure or garden. All these sounds continue right the way through to the day, so Gar meant garden, enclosure, something to do with garden. And then you've got Sag, which means head, and that originally would have been a picture of a garden with three channels to irrigate it with, so that's why it's an irrigated garden, and the Sag would have looked just like a man's head, which was the simple form of picture writing. In the beginning, this is O'Brien, the settlement of the Anunnaki, they call the Anunnaki, which is the same as the Shining Ones, and Anunnaki means the people of the god An. The settlement of the Anunnaki was indicated by the ideograms, which had a phonetic value of Garsag or Karsag, and appear to mean either the principal fenced enclosure or the lofty fenced enclosure. Possibly both translations are valid. The Anunnaki were the Sumerian equivalents of the biblical angels. Only after they disappeared from the Middle Eastern scene were they worshipped in the religious sense, and they were then so enveloped in supernatural trappings that their intrinsic advanced and benevolent characteristics were swamped in a morass of pseudo-religious adulation. Christian O'Brien, CBE, in the Genius of the Few and the Shining Ones. Now the gods chose the Bekaa Valley between the snow-capped mountains of Lebanon, close to Mount Hermon, on a south-facing slope, where there was a good supply of snow-melt water, fertile soil, and an ideal location for irrigation agriculture on a lake bed which they had drained. During the Younger Dryas Ice Age, this area was a glacial refuge for the important wild grasses, the oak, cedar, pistachio, and olive. They chose the perfect site for the restart of agriculture at the beginning of the Holocene in 9400 BC. This is when the planet, which at 40% was frozen, began to melt rapidly and warm up. We get a confirmation from these early records that there always was one God. It's a very important aspect of our history. We're told that we have the one God. There was always one God, and that one God's name was An. And confirmation from the earliest records and oral traditions that religion was based on the one God whose name was An. That's chapter 1, God's Credentials by Philip Blair. The idea that it was all terrible, there were many gods, etc. is nonsense. Another terrible Christian misrepresentation of the truth. This is another Sumerian tablet from the Nippur collection, Man's Golden Age. It's one of the unpublished pieces belonging to the Sumerian epic poem whose hero Enmerkar ruled in the city of Erech sometime during the 4th millennium BC. The passage enclosed by the black line describes the blissful and unrivaled state of man in an era of universal peace, before he'd learned to know fear and before the confusion of tongues. Its contents, reminiscent of Genesis 11:1, read as follows from Sumerian mythology by Samuel Noah Kramer. In those days there was no snake, there was no scorpion, there was no hyena, there was no lion, there was no wild dog, no wolf. There was no fear, no terror, man had no rival. In those days the land of Shuba, which is the east, a place of plenty, of righteous decrees, Harmony tongue, Suma, south, the great land of the decrees of princeship, Uri, north, the land having all that is needful, the land of Martu, the west, resting in security, the whole universe, the people in Eunice, the Enel in one tongue gave praise. In the Louvre Museum we have a wonderful stele which is massive, it's much taller than me, and it's a king being presented with the measuring rod and standard unit, which is a standard unit of measurement, and a rolled measuring tape by Sharmesh, the lawgiver of the Shining Ones. And Thorkild Jackson translated the opening words on this law stele as the edicts of An and Enlil. And An and Enlil were the two key people leading the group that restarted civilization. The Lord of the Rings is depicted here as astronomer Sharmesh on top of a diorite stele inscribed with the law codes attributed to King Hammurabi. As one of the Shining Ones, otherwise known as the Elohim, Genii, Abkalu or gods, Sharmesh is passing the ring and the rod, key symbols of authority or rule, to the Mesopotamian king, and the date they've given here is about 1792 BC. It may be in fact much earlier, but that is needs to be investigated. Originally the ring consisted of a rolled surveyor's tape, and the rod was the standard unit of measurement used across the world from as early as 9,500 BC at Jericho to the main structures around about 700 AD. As a tenant of the gods, Hammurabi was in fact reaffirming the original common law edicts of An and Enlil. Steles were placed in public places declaring the primary legal basis for human rights, eventually adopted in the Hebraic codes. Now these laws came through to the laws of Melutius and King Alfred, right the way through to our own laws. And this is where it started, and it goes right back to the benevolent gods and their law code. Here we have an image of the measuring rod and tape, a little more detail. That's a subject in itself, of the standard units of measurement, because that enables us to follow the path of the Shining Ones for 9,000 years, and we can check their standard units of measurements in all the buildings they constructed. And on the right is a round tablet, which is the form of tablet used for putting the dimensions of fields, and that is the measurements of 11 fields. And that is in the one of the important museums in Germany. And this is Confucius's quote about this time: "When the great Tao prevailed, the whole world was one community. men of talent and virtue were chosen to lead the people. Their words were sincere and they cultivated harmony. This was called the Age of Universality. Confucius. The Lady Ninkar-sag is the goddess of irrigation. This is a wonderful image which is hopefully still intact in the Aleppo Museum and was found in the city of Mari. And Mari was one of the great cities on the Euphrates. And this is a statue of the Lady Ninkar-sag. She's called Mama in Akkadian, in the guise of the goddess of irrigation, found at Mari on the upper Euphrates in Syria, on display in the Aleppo Museum. And she says here, this is one of the Karsag tablets, the crucial Karsag tablets, which O'Brien translated. With this settlement will come prosperity. An enclosed reservoir, a water trap, should be established. The good land is full of water. Because of the water, food will be plentiful. Karsag translates as head, sag, enclosure, kar, and represents the location of a Sumerian creation story, which suggests a restart of civilization run about 9,350 BC following global catastrophe at the Karsag, which is the Garden of Eden site in southern Lebanon. Now, Mari is also found in India. She changes into Kali, Ka, Kotoliku, and by the time we get to Mexico, she is a great big stone figure with snakes all over her, and people are having their hearts cut out in her name. So she was, if you like, demonized over time by successive generations who had invented their own religious ideas, which usually means human sacrifice, killing each other, and the kind of the loss of that initial wonderful peace and law and order. When we actually look at this city of Mari, which is located in present-day Syria on the Euphrates, we're looking at the most incredible sophistication in terms of design, cities which had a very high percentage of orchards, and almost total control of water levels for irrigation, rich silt from washed down those valleys being utilised by farmers to feed the towns, and incredible sophistication as early as 4000 BC or earlier. And I think that's something that children aren't taught in school and should be taught in school. You have a wonderful past, an incredibly good organisation, very good town planning, and of course agriculture being the key. The Sumerian origins of the Indus Valley civilizations is also very important, because it wasn't just the land between the two rivers, Mesopotamia, it was also the Indus colony, as it would have been, of the Sumerians, and the colony of the Indus Valley, as in India, was founded by the Sumerian king Uraeus. Nina, the name of the Vedas, is also here in the Indian epics. The founder of the Indus colony may also be known as King Magdal, who was also the governor and king of Elam. And Elam, its capital, was called Susa, and we're right back to Dionysius of Susa, who wrote that lovely poem about the dispersal of people from the land of Canaan. And that was a province, in fact, in southwest Persia. So right the way from Syria through to what is modern-day Iraq, right the way into Persia, and then into the Indus Valley, it was all the same kind of people doing all kinds of sophisticated things. And this is Lieutenant Colonel L.A. Waddell, one of the great historians and linguists, and he says here, the Sumerian king Uraeus, or Nina, was the son of Hercules of the Phoenicians and the Greeks, identified with the Sumerian epic hero Gilgamesh of Erech. Gilgamesh, or Gizax, being king and some priest of Bel, Endura or Indura, by the Hittites around 3150 BC. the Hittites were in Syria. Here is a town on the River Indus. Can't quite see it here, but we're going to look at the river in a minute. Well, this is Dolavira town and its citadel in about 2400. It may be older than that, it may go back to 3000, 3200. But this is at a time when the Thar Desert, which is the Indian desert, was beginning to dry out, along with the Arabian desert and the Sahara desert. And it was just before the great catastrophe which really closed down most of the city-states between the Mediterranean and China. The forecasted catastrophe of cometary debris arrived in 2345, and that was a critical date for everything changing. The monsoons, winds moving south, and our history books having to be rewritten, and the loss of a great civilization which had sorted out most of the problems of organizing life peacefully and successfully. Here is the same town, and you'll see what they did as they were running short of water. They diverted the River Indus around the town, feeding water into great big storage tanks, and that enabled them to have irrigation water for the whole year. Khorshabad was near Nineveh in Iraq, and the throne room was decorated with reliefs of the gods, which are now in the British Museum. Now, if you go to the Assyrian room in the British Museum, you'll see figures of the archangels and angels and watchers, or they're also called the ancient masters. Now, the successor to Sargon II, Ashburnipal, collected a magnificent library of cuneiform tablets and said that he'd been taught to read the writing from before the flood. Now this is 721-705 Sargon, and his successor had been taught at the kingship school the alphabet or alphabet which the Druids gave to the Greeks. Another reference to that very, very important story of there being two types of writing. The alphabet taught in the kingship schools and amongst the Druids, and then the ordinary people were given the picture language which evolved into cuneiform. Here is one of the images from the British Museum Assyrian Gallery, and it's one of the Shining Ones, or Elohim, or Abkalu means bright farmer, from the enclosure, from the principal room of the Khorshabad Palace of Sargon II, 720 BC. And Genesis 1:25, the Hebron translation, God made every kind of wild beast, every cattle, every kind of reptile. God saw that it was good. And the proper modern critical interpretation of the earliest Hebrew text and an alternative Genesis, the Elohim busied themselves with, cared for, all kinds of wildlife on the land and all kinds of domesticated animals which were plentiful on the ground. The Elohim took delight in them all. This specific interpretational analysis is summarized as follows by the Hebraians in 1997. The Elohim were creating domesticated animals and utilizing wild animals, caring for them and tending them as all good farmers do. This is Lao Tzu in China on the ancient masters, and he's talking ancient masters are the Elohim, the Shining Ones, and he's writing this in 550 BC. The ancient masters were subtle, mysterious, profound, responsive. The depth of their knowledge is unfathomable. Because it is unfathomable, all we can do is so describe their appearance. Watchful, like men crossing a winter stream. Alert, like men aware of danger. Courteous, like visiting guests, yielding like ice about to melt, simple like uncarved blocks of wood. And that's Lao Tzu in Tao Te Ching, chapter 15. And there is a statue of Lao Tzu on his ox, marking the spot where he stopped and dismounted before climbing to Lugan Tai, which is a mountain, to write the Tao Te Ching. And he was literally leaving at one point on his ox, and somebody said to him, "Well, have you written everything down? And so we know what your history is, that we all know about it." He said, "No, I haven't yet." So he said, "Will you please go and write a history for us?" Which is what he did. And that's where before he went off to write the Tao Te Ching. And that's images from the Jesus Sutras by Martin Parr, another very important book to read. Now this is ancient philosophy, the Tao. The Tao is still a pillar of Chinese society. Every person within themselves possesses the four principles of benevolence, justice, propriety and wisdom, and that each person has only to obey the law within themselves in order to be perfect. Words of Meng Zhu. Meng Zhu was a student of Confucius. Plato emphasized soon afterwards, right about 500 BC, that good people do not need laws, and bad people will break them anyway. And a lovely quote here, again from the I Ching by Lao Tzu: "The superior person who seeks not only things, but the Tao of things is rare. The Tao of the universe is indeed kindness and wisdom, but essentially Tao is also beyond kindness and wisdom." Plato, writing in his book The Republic in the 3rd century BC, insisted that the gods, in contradiction to some of the stories, are the source of good only and cannot be responsible for anything evil in this world. This is why he was so critical of stories claiming their supposed failings, however allegorical, and they should not be repeated, especially to the young. And here, what a reference from Gautama Buddha, who lived from 563 to 483 BC, and knew the Druids, communicated with the Druids. It's very important. And as I shall show later, links with Jesus. "Follow then the shining ones, for the wise, the awakened, the loving, for they know how to work and forbear." Gautama Buddha. And Jesus in Kashmir was regarded as a successor and an equal to Buddha. And 2 gold coins were minted, one with Buddha's head, the other with Jesus' head, by the king in Kashmir when Jesus arrived there and spent his time there. That is very, very important to realize what Jesus was doing there. Jesus was also having meetings with Thomas in northern India, and Thomas was actually asked to build a palace, being an architect for one of the kings at Taxila in northern India. And that these are views, later views from Alexandria, which was visited earlier, on the Golden Age. The Alexandrians had a profound interest in what they saw as the pure and simple wisdom of the Druids. Their view, like that propounded in the book of Genesis, was that man had fallen from grace, and that developed society was deficient compared to the golden age of the past. They shared this opinion with many other thinkers of classical antiquity, notably the 8th century BC Greek poet Hesiod and the 1st century AD Roman Lucretius. What was the British Church? 2 very important pieces of further information to tell us that we have to totally reverse our views on religion. All had originally one language and one religion. This was the religion of Jesus, the everlasting gospel. Antiquity preaches the gospel of Jesus. William Blake, 1757 to 1827. And second, from St. Augustine, who came as the Pope's representative to persuade us all, very unfairly, you might feel, that Roman Catholicism was the answer and we should forget everything else we've learned. But he actually said this: "For the thing itself, which is now called the Christian religion, really was known to the ancients, nor was wanting at any time from the beginning of the human race until the time when Christ came into flesh, whence the true religion, which had previously existed, began to be called Christian." So here you have St. Augustine, the Pope's messenger, actually saying, well, the true religion really is Druidism. How about that? I think that sums up my message that I'm trying to get across to you all. And here a postscript on this issue from the great Sir Alan Gardner, who was the greatest linguist of Egyptian hieroglyphs, and he was there when Tutankhamun's tomb was discovered, and this is one of his quotes, and it's very important. "From the Egyptian point of view, we may say that there was no such thing as religion. There was only Heka, and the nearest English equivalent of which is magical power." I will add the most important issue for the world today and the world then. This concept that equality of women in the ancient world. They had equality of women. We, in our ignorance over the past 3,000 years, have denigrated women. And it's one of the greatest tragedies. And it's something we should put right as quickly as possible. Now, in the ancient world, the words Yahweh meant leader, and Asherah meant his consort, could be his wife, which is the equivalent of what the words we use today for the mayor and mayoress. So the smallest village, town or great city-state, we had the leader and his consort. There was always a man and a woman involved. So if we have a mayor of London, we should have a mayoress of London. Second most important point, and this tradition still survives in the Himalayas, where the women decided on who they slept with and when. They're expected to understand the cycles of the moon. They're expected to understand, because of that knowledge of the cycles of the moon, as to when they were likely to get pregnant or not. They made the decision on who they slept with and when. It was their choice. And men had to accept that and realize that. And if a woman, or you made friends with a woman and she was lucky enough to like you, who'd want to sleep with you, that she'd take your hand and rub the palm of your hand discreetly, and that was the message that you had a chance of making real friends with her. Women had special incentives if they did not have children. They could own property, run businesses, own slaves, who were bonded servants protected by strict laws, not what we normally think of slaves. And they became slaves usually to pay off debts. They became a slave until they'd paid their debts off. In India today, women who can't pay their debts go and work in the brickworks, and the rate of interest on their debts is so high they very rarely get out of those brickworks. You have no idea how fair the ancient laws were. Now the veil first appeared in Assyria under the Assyrians when things had broken down following the great catastrophes. And interestingly, in the 1930s, Shah Reza, the father of the Shah we most know in Persia, which is of course Iran, lifted the veil. And I have a wonderful image in one of my previous presentations of women dressed in Western dress and wearing lovely hats and all sorts of things, celebrating the fact that their leader had said they didn't have to wear a burqa or a veil. Very interesting point about history. But the rigid religious views of the priests could not be overturned. But that's another story for the future. Just briefly on Cymric origins, more than 3,000 years ago, people who spoke the old Cymric language were broadly known as the ancient British or Welsh. Later, around 650 BC, descendants of King Omri, king of Samaria, in Celtic Cymru is still pronounced Comri, they came as farmers, graziers and tradesmen from the eastern Mediterranean to carry out their trades and skills, making their home principally in Wales from Cardiff to Yorkshire, occupying lands devastated by cometary debris. They joined indigenous peoples and descendants of earlier migrations from the eastern Mediterranean of the peoples of the god An. Now these people were people of King Omri, and King Omri was very much linked to King David and the Hebrew world at that time. But the people who came from Samaria were Druids. Very, very important point. Of their ancient laws, the edicts of An and Enlil once stood above all others, namely the law that protected the lives, roles, skills and prominent position of the husbandman, stockman and shepherd. They were at the head of the hierarchy, and they were supported by the artificers who provided the farmer, stockman and shepherd with the things they needed and took the food from the husbandman, stockman and shepherd back to the people in the towns. The soldiers were the next most important group, and they protected the farmers and the land and the food supplies. In modern terms, a key part of an ancient law is tenant right, a fair value placed on the work carried out to provide land suitable for and in good heart for all types of food production. Tenant right is crucial. These master craftsmen and women have subsequently deployed their agricultural skills and knowledge in their adopted homes and around the world, bringing untold benefits and quality of life to indigenous peoples of the countries they populated. Agricultural production was maintained often in the most adverse circumstances and on the most demanding land, following great commodity price depressions and forced migrations. Many successful attempts have been made to subject the husbandman, stockman and shepherd to the corrupt overlordship of land, not just for rent or tithe, but nearly always because of the value of their skill in providing food and other linked resources. Current situation is the loss of common sense and practical skills. Now in the 21st century we are seeing a contrived and deliberate attempt to remove these master craftsmen from their land and destroy the generations of accumulated agricultural land and wildlife management skills. Solution to their problems lie with educating our modern world to the facts about agriculture and wildlife management, and ensuring that safety nets and support exist to prevent good farmers and wildlife managers from being put out of business by the constant failures of bad government. Sufis were Hanifs, perfect ones. Abraham, Muhammad's wife and sister-in-law were all Hanifs. Sufi were allied with the Cathars, and those Sufis who escaped the crusade which the hounds of hell perpetrated upon them, went to join the Bogomils in the Balkans, where the problems still continue, and a library, a museum, was recently targeted by US bombers. This library held their sacred books. That's Robert Baird again, the author of Diverse Druids. And from the Sufis, who are part of Islam, we get the Sunnis and the Shias, who were two groups that broke apart much later on. So their traditions go back to this important, wonderful source, as ours do. And we all need to wake up to our real history of religion so we can all work together and love each other and understand that our beliefs go back to a common benevolent source. Same with the Hindus. Hinduism is a diverse system of thought with beliefs spanning monotheism, polytheism, paganism, monotheism, atheism, agnosticism, Gnosticism, among others. concept of God is complex and depends on each particular tradition and philosophy. It's sometimes referred to as henothetic, in other words, involving devotion to a single God while accepting the existence of others. That's a nice compromise. But any such term is an overgeneralization. And this is very important. Hindu is said to be the oldest religion, but this is a Hindu scriptures refer to a celestial entities called the Devas, or Deva in feminine form. Devata used synonymously for Deva in Hindi, which is the shining ones. They may be translated into English as gods or heavenly beings, so the Hindus were aware of the shining ones. The Devas are an integral part of Hindu culture and are depicted in art, architecture and through icons, and mythological stories about them are related in the scriptures, particularly in Indian epic poetry and the Purana. They are, however, often distinguished from Ishvara, a supreme personal god, with many Hindus worshipping Ishvara in one of its particular manifestations, or ostensibly separate deities, as their Ista, Devata, or chosen ideal. The choice is a matter of individual preference or regional or family traditions, but they are paying their respects to the shining ones, so they go back to the same source. I'm just adding this additional one or two items here which are going to be important, because some of the biggest problems we face are, as we know, enormous religious divisions and political divisions which are destroying the world, literally. Some people have even said that we're in World War III. And it would appear that government and faith is almost out of control. And we need to be able to speak to people and persuade people that we all really believe in the same kind of things, and we've got to get back to the source of that material so that we can actually learn how to cope with the problems we've got today. And that means coping with bankruptcy, debt, the fact that we have 350 million unemployed Muslims, and the impact that's having in the Muslim world, as well as many other countries in the world. Hindu belief in the soul. Most Hindus believe that the spirit or soul, the true self of every person, called the Atman, is eternal. According to the monistic and pantheistic theologies of Hinduism, such as Advaita Vedanta school, this Atman is ultimately indistinct from Brahman, the Supreme Spirit. Hence these schools are called non-dualist. The goal for life, according to the Advaita school, is to realize that one's Atman is identical to Brahman, the Supreme Soul. The Upanishads state that whoever becomes fully aware of the Atman as the innermost core of one's own self realizes an identity with Brahman and thereby reaches moksha, liberation or freedom. Now this is very, very similar to all the teachings of the journeys of the soul, which are centered on Jesus's teachings to his inner circle of disciples, described in the first presentation I did on this broad subject, which is Learning from History 13. We have this marvellous quote, which is in fact a favourite of Barbara Joy O'Brien's, who has a chapter in The Genius of the Few showing, it's called The Unity of Truth, and it shows how all religions are linked together. And this is the quotation: "We have endowed him with sight and hearing, and be he thankful or oblivious to our favours, we have shown him the right path." And that is Quran, Q-U-R''A''N. Now that is a sacred scripture of Islam, and for all Muslims the very word of God, revealed through the agency of Archangel Gabriel to the Prophet Muhammad. Although most modern Muslims know it as the Holy Quran, many of them still refer it to as Al-Quran or Al-Karim, or Al-Quran al-Majid, which can best be translated as the Noble Quran or the Glorious Quran. We translate the Quran as the readings and recitations of An, which takes the Muslim understanding of religion right back to the original man who led a small group of people who restarted civilization and agriculture at Karsag in around about 9,500 at the end of the Great Younger Dryas Ice Age. Here I've put a lovely picture of one of the most important sites in Britain. I've now discovered that it's the second Christian church in Britain, 62 AD at Llanillid, and it's a later church in this photograph, and there's a mound, a ridge mound, which was in fact a site of the house or building used by Joseph of Arimathea, number 3, same man as Joseph of Arimathea. He was called Illid in Welsh, and it was close to iron and coal deposits in South Wales, literally a few hundred yards away. And it was quoted by Tacitus as a safe house for Christians. And Tacitus was born in AD 56, and so during his life, when he was recording history, he made this particular statement, which is very interesting. The first church is undoubtedly at Llandaff, which is on the edge of Cardiff, and the first high dry ground on the River Taff, and that clearly was the first Christian church, almost certainly dedicated by Joseph of Arimathea and Urgain at an earlier time. Urgain was responsible for, they say, up to 100 corps or choirs, which were centres of education in the land of the Silurian people, which is South Wales. This slide is 500 years later from Llanillid and Llandaff and Glastonbury, and on Iona in Scotland under Columba. Now this is a long while after the original teachings of Jesus and Thomas and the family of Caractacus and all the work that they did. And this is a point really where Christianity took over from the Druids in Iona, and it's very clear that women were downgraded at this point. And this is a book on Iona. There was hostility towards Columba. It was a question of copyright of books, other issues in Ireland, and he was thrown out of Ireland and went to Iona. There was little different with the beliefs of the Druids, but distinct cult submitting to rules and calling themselves Culdees. Their institution was a monastery called monastery for men and women. They were married. It was a women's island, however, and wives did not reside in the institution, only bound by obedience. To poverty they did not bind themselves. On the contrary, they seemed to have laboured diligently to procure for themselves and those dependent on them the comforts of life. Now, I've included in this presentation the key subject of original sin. And this is something which is very important to discuss and to see where it came from, and the consequences of it are that every Christian religion seems to consider original sin as an important factor, whether they're Anglicans or whether they're many of the other variations of Christianity. And we have problems because the concept of regarding your children as sinful and born sinful actually creates a lot of problems, and I'm going to show you where this original sin idea originated and why it is so wrong. Now, the greatest educational establishment in Britain, one of 4 key centres, Old Sarum, Llantwit Major, Bangor-on-Dee Druidic Academy, and Glastonbury were the four most important centres from very early times and regarded as Druidic academies. But Bangor-on-Dee was special. You can see it's in the curve of the sacred River Dee. You go there today and you're told that Christianity started with the message from Augustine of Canterbury when the Pope sent him to Britain to convert the British, and anybody before Augustine of Canterbury is regarded as a pagan or a heretic. Well, we know that's totally wrong and disgraceful. But on this site we had a magnificent monastery. It was clearly visited by Jesus, and St. Paul followed on, as St. Paul followed the trail of Jesus around all these areas. And in fact, St. Paul talks about Bangor-on-Dee, and on the four gates of Bangor-on-Dee were, if a man will not work, he will not eat. The rule of Paul. And so that's a very interesting aspect. And so then we have Paul travelling to London and preaching on the site of St. Paul's. But he's really following up on Jesus and actually producing a stricter branch of religion, which is far less credible than the honest beliefs of Jesus and his twin brother Thomas. Now this is where the Pelagian heresy, as it's called, or the defence of free will over original sin, and this is between the dates of 386 and 430. The Pelagian heresy originated by Morgan or Morion. Morion may have been a variation of that Welsh name Morgan. And he was the 20th abbot of Bangor, being in truth nothing else than a revival of Druidism and the old Druidic ideas with regard to the nature and free will of man. Because of his principles and hostility towards them from those more closely linked to the new religion in Rome, he resigned from Bangor and was sent by a synod at Winchester, and he went abroad to take on these issues direct with the church authorities in Rome, as well in North Africa and Jerusalem, finally returning to die in his native land after the most eloquent, exemplary, authoritative attempt to preserve the principle of free will, man's primary requirement. Pelagius, his Roman name, was born on the same day as his principal opponent on this critical issue, Augustine of Hippo, November the 13th, AD 354. Augustine of Hippo successfully promoted the Catholic principle of original sin and divine grace over free will. He was killed, in fact, by Arian Christian vandals in North Africa. And Arian Christians were the version of Christianity which Jesus and Thomas had followed. It's very important to remember that Pelagius spoke fluent Greek, was a wonderful advocate, and the most educated man we had in Britain at that time. It is also memorable that when Pelagius, 20th abbot of Bangor, on receiving an admonition from the bishops of Gaul and Italy, the Bishop of Rome included, on the latitudinarian nature of his principles, he returned it with the observation, otherwise he was pretty upset with this being told what to do by Rome. It sounds familiar, doesn't it? Told what to do by the EU. And he returned with the quote, "Sola in Britannia Ecclesia Britannica Jude." Only in Britain is the British Church judged. He was accompanied on this journey by Coelestius, who we now find represented both Ireland and southern Scotland on the same issue. So we have clearly British unity on the concept of free will over original sin. Now the tenets of original sin put forward by Pelagius in his attempt to retain the Druidic and British Church principle of free will, published at Rome previous to AD 409, and this is from the Encyclopedia Britannica, that Adam would have died even if he had not sinned, that the sin of Adam injured himself alone, not the human race, that newborn children are in the same condition in which Adam was before the fall, that the whole human race does not die because Adam's death or sin, nor will the race rise again because of the resurrection of Christ, that the law gives entrance to heaven as well as the gospel, that even before the coming of Christ there were men who were entirely without sin. Interesting, the law gives entrance to heaven as well as the gospel. One of the great quotations attributed to Thoth, was also called Hermes and Enoch, was that the law is the precursor to freedom. And that applies today more than anything else, that the law should be observed by everybody. Nobody is above the law, king nor God. Now, when we come to what happened and why Augustine of Hippo decided that we were all sinful, we find that it was a text taken from the books of Enoch. And I'm going to read this out because Christian O'Brien did a tremendous amount of work on the Secrets of Enoch in particular. And we realized that 15 or 16 people had tried to translate the books of Enoch, and only one or two had really succeeded and made a good job of it. And O'Brien followed this up. And this is the quotation with O'Brien's comments below. "After this, the men brought me to the sixth haven, and there I saw 7 groups of angels, very bright and wonderful, with their faces shining brighter than the sun." In a previous presentation I've explained that they were wearing a sunblock on their faces, which made them look very fearsome. And so they were pretty ordinary people as far as we're concerned. But he says, "They were brilliant and all dressed alike and looked alike. Some of these angels study the movements of the stars, the moon and the sun, and record the peaceful order of the world. Other angels there undertake teaching and give instruction in clear and melodious voices. These are the angels who are promoted over the ordinary angels." So the archangels are promoted out of the angels, and beneath the angels, in fact, are the watchers. Now, they are responsible for recording and studying the fauna and flora in both the highlands and the lowlands. There are angels who record the seasons and the years, others who study the rivers and the seas, others who study the fruits of the lowlands, and the plants and herbs which give nourishment to men and beasts. And the angels study mankind and record the behaviour of men and how they live. Now, O'Brien makes this point. The passage goes even further and provides a rational explanation for the religious concept of the recording angel and the writing down of the good and bad deeds of men. From this account, we can now understand that these angel investigators were only observing mankind from an anthropology point of view, a genetic and psychological viewpoints. They were not concerned with guilt or original sin, which can now be seen as superimpositions by later misunderstanding religious interpreters. Now, I do recommend that people buy The Genius of the Few, which will be available towards the end of 2016 again, being reprinted. All the books are being reprinted. And there is a section on Enoch and Enoch's records, and they make a marvellous endorsement of all the teaching and all the material that I've been putting forward on the subject of the Shining Ones. It's the translation, an alternative translation of Genesis. It's the Sumerian text, which I'm going to deal with at the end of this talk, and also it's the books of Enoch, and you've got 3 totally independent sources telling the same story to back up the information which I'm giving you. Free will or original sin. You're back to Pelagius, 20th abbot of Bangor-on-Dee. He left for Rome about AD 390. Without freedom of will there is no humanity. Freedom of conscience was both the birth and breath of manhood. The essence of the soul was will. When we look at plants and animals and just about everything on this planet, is this ability, the freedom of movement, free will, outside a totalitarian type system that actually allows every living thing to better itself, to think, to improve, to do all kinds of incredible things. It's a basic principle of evolution and good behavior too. This basic Druid doctrine was promoted by the Church under its intellectual leader Pelagius, and he took this message to Rome until he was confirmed a heretic. After 7 hearings, he conducted himself brilliantly, but Augustine of Hippo made sure that his followers ganged up against Pelagius, and his colleague Calestius was also turned into a heretic by the so-called Catholic Church at that time. Augustine, who had unjustly insisted upon Catholic dogma of original sin, as I've said before, was eventually killed by Arian Christian Vandals in North Africa. However, the concept that we are born sinful remains church policy on a massive scale. And unfortunately, what goes with it is pay us some money and we will forgive your sins. And allow you to draw your own conclusions from this evidence. Now there's just a little bit from a Welsh historian, and I love his name, Theophilus Evans. And this is just an extract that I'm reading to you which confirms more evidence on this particular subject. If the account of the Welsh historian Theophilus Evans is to be believed, then Augustine was no saint, and that is Augustine of Canterbury. He is commonly credited with bringing Christianity to the Saxons in Britain. Well, that isn't strictly true because it was the Saxons were much later. But when he went to Wales, he encouraged the Saxon army to carry out a massacre of 1,200 monks, some people say 2,000, and scholars at Bangor Isicoed near Wrexham, which is Bangor-on-Dee. And in fact, it was the Northumberland king and his army, under the instructions of Augustine from Canterbury, that slaughtered these monks and scholars, and Augustine himself sat in a chair and watched it happening. Christianity arrived in Britain during the 1st century AD, as I've described in my article. This is an article from the Annamundi.com website. Early British Christianity. The notion that Augustine brought Christianity to Britain is pure myth. He came here as a representative of the Pope and persuaded the Saxon kings to submit to Rome. There were mass baptisms all over the country as the Saxon people followed the example of their leaders. Then in 601 he went to Wales expecting the same success, but was disappointed. The Welsh already had the true faith given to them by the early church, and they did not need any new innovations from Rome. I say here Roman Catholic dominance by force. Augustine demanded that the Britons should accept all the doctrines of the Roman Catholic Church, although he offered them time to do it in a piecemeal fashion without converting to Roman Catholicism at once. When they refused, he instigated the Saxon army to attack the monastery at Bangor Isicoed. And in fact there were, as I said, probably 2,000 monks and scholars killed, and this included 4 of the Welsh kings and their much smaller army. And he sat and watched this massacre happening. But a similar situation 150 years later, when King Charlemagne in France and Germany beheaded over 400 people who refused to convert to Catholicism. So if we want some advice on original sin, we can look to a quote from Jesus, which I believe is in John, or it may have been removed as it didn't fit in with the Catholic doctrine and modern church doctrine. And this is the quotation, which I'm assured is reliable. "For God has created you in his own likeness, innocent, with pure souls and hearts filled with goodness, destined not for the conception of evil schemes, but to sanctuaries for love and justice." And that's Jesus' message. The Catholic doctrine of original sin, on which European laws are still based, guilty before being proved innocent, are based on a false understanding taken from the books of Enoch, which was church canon at the time of the perpetrator of this injustice, Augustine of Hippo, round about 395 AD. I'm just going to give you a little overview on Christianity. Rome was not the founding seat of the Christian faith. The movement began in Britain, notably at Glastonbury, some while before St. Paul went to Rome. Emperor Constantine proclaimed Christianity as the state religion of Rome because he had been born, raised and lived until his imperial appointment as a Christian in York. Just before his death he received an Arian Christian bishop, the style of Christianity that he'd encountered in Britain. And interestingly, at the Council of Nicaea, the main protagonist or promoter of Christianity was said to have been a man called Chrestus in Rome in 49 AD. And Chrestus was a Latin name for King of Kings, and so that, in fact, was Jesus, well after the crucifixion. He didn't die on the cross. What St. Augustine brought from Rome to England in AD 597 to Canterbury was not Christianity as commonly taught, but Roman Catholicism. Conclusion. Notwithstanding all the centuries of historical and monistic documentary record in England, the most comprehensive survey on the subject of Christian religious heritage was that of the Vatican librarian Cardinal Cesare Baronis, who almost became Pope. Having spent 30 years searching the Vatican and Lateran Palace archives, he is regarded as the most learned ever scholar of church history, and his 1601 Annals Ecclesiasticae is one of the foremost documents of Christian literature ever written. Despite all the orthodox propaganda of Rome, however, Baronius deduced that Polydoro, that's Polydore Virgulo, who wrote the history of Britain for Henry VII, Eusebius, Tertullian, Gildas, the much maligned William of Malmesbury and Geoffrey of Monmouth, and all others, including St. Augustine, had been correct. Rome was not the founding city of Christianity. The first beginnings of Christian piety existed in Britain, and its birthplace from AD 35 was Glastonbury. There shouldn't be any more argument on this subject, and that, of course, is some of the marvellous work carried out by Lawrence Gardner. End of the British Church, AD 664. Now, the British Church was dissolved at the Council of Whitby in AD 664 and supplanted by totalitarian Catholicism, which ruthlessly enforced the overlordship of land, religious dogma such as original sin, and the appointment of monarchs. That was through the donation of Constantine, which fraudulently gave the popes the right to appoint kings, something that Henry VIII found out a long while after he asked the Pope if he could marry again. Above all, the removal of natural laws which required free will and the equality of men and women. I believe that what we have now is a fitting summary of world religions, and I believe it's something which Christians and Islam, all the various branches of religions, the nonconformists, whatever you like to call yourself. And it's this message: neither Jesus nor Muhammad wanted a new religion. it was clear that they both wanted to return to the Abrahamic faith of the Golden Age. A grave is reserved beside Muhammad in Mecca for Jesus on his death after the prophecy of his second coming. Abraham was a Hanif, perfect one, very similar to the Sufis, very similar to the Druids, and knew who the gods were, their laws, and their importance to civilized living. Above all, through divine kingship, the delivery of freedom, justice, leisure and instruction to all the people, or all the citizens. Both Jesus and Confucius taught that we should do unto others as we would have them do unto us, summed up in one word: reciprocity. We don't really have to do anything more than remember that one word and follow those basic rules. Now I'm moving on to the subject of the Garden of Eden, on which most of my presentations feature in various components and parts. And my greatest concern is that the religious establishment and the academic establishment in particular, particularly in Oxford, Cambridge and in Pennsylvania, where the Karsag tablets reside in the University Museum, trying to get the academics out of their straitjackets and open their minds and actually look at this wonderful story, which is our story, all of us. It's perhaps the greatest story never told, and we should know, because it's one way in which we can influence all the groups on the planet who are spending so much time and energy disagreeing with and fighting one another. So just look now at some of these basic factors, and also look at what the academics have done with this material and the reasons why. Now we're talking here of the Levantine corridor hypothesis of O'Brien, which he'd worked out clearly in 1984. And it was this: the gods chose the Bekaa Valley between the snow-capped mountains of the Lebanon, close to Mount Hermon, on a south-facing slope, where there was a good supply of snow-melt water, fertile soil, and an ideal location for irrigation agriculture on a lake bed which they had drained. During the Great Younger Dryas Ice Age, this area was a glacial refuge for important wild grasses, something like 90% of them, the oak, cedar, pistachio and olive. They actually chose a perfect site for the restart of agriculture at the beginning of the Holocene, or wholly recent period of time, round about 9,400 BC. We're told in the Sumerian account what happened. And O'Brien makes this, starts this off with the extracts of archaic cuneiform from the Karsag epics featured in the Genius of the Few by Christian and Barbara Jordan. We have two symbols here, and they are what we call cuneiform, and I'm going to show you how that evolved and the problems of translating it. Now, words were comprised of wedge-shaped lines written on reeds, and each had a phonetic sound with a meaning. And the one on the left is gar or kar, very similar to the word garden, and we've had recent research in the last few weeks, in fact, where if you go all over the planet, the sounds we make for all the different words are surprisingly similar. In other words, we can tell the story of going back to one original source with all the speech on the planet. So here we have gar, an irrigated enclosure or garden, and the indications that it was irrigated are those three lines in the middle of that area, so to speak, which indicates that it's a garden which was irrigated. and the second sign is sag, which is a sound. So the sound was gar, sag, or car sag, and the second sign, sag, is actually a head, and I'm going to show you that head. Cuneiform script. The cuneiform script underwent considerable changes over a period of more than 2 millennia. The image below shows the development of the sign sag for head. Now you can see it was first just like an ordinary head, and if it was to speak, the mouth was open. To drink, there was a water sign in front of it, etc., etc. So it was very clear for an ordinary person to see what that picture actually meant, and it was a picture language for everybody, for the people. In-house they used what is called an Aleph beg, which I will refer to that later, but the Aleph beg was the speedy writing of Enoch used in-house, and eventually passed from the Druids to the Greeks, who over 100 years adopted it as the Greek letters. So you can see here the first head, then it's tipped on its side, and then it's written in straight lines with a wedge-shaped reed, and then it becomes ever more complex, where the scribes have made changes, and the only people who really understand it were the scribes by the time we get to 6 and 7, which is the time of the Akkadians. And unfortunately our academics cannot believe there was great sophistication the farther you go back, and therefore they start their training of people to understand this cuneiform script with the Akkadian script, which starts in 1600 BC. What O'Brien did, which was different, was to go right back to the original picture signs in order that he became the person who was best able to translate the cuneiform text. And he picked up upon work that had already been done by the Reverend Professor George Barton, who worked at the Bryn Mawr University in Pennsylvania. He was a Quaker. And I'll show you, this is what I'm going to read out. It is we can change the dates and make them much earlier now, but stage 1 shows the pictogram as it was drawn around 3000 BC. Stage 2 shows the rotated pictogram as written around 2800. Stage 3 shows the abstracted glyph in archaic monumental inscriptions, which in fact we can redate them all much earlier, and even the very earliest cuneiform now we can, which is the wedge-shaped lines, we can date that to at least 4600 at the time of Uruk. And at stage 4 it's written on clay, and it's the same sign written on clay, contemporary to stage 3. Stage 5 represents the late 3rd millennium. Stage 6 represents the old Assyrian ductus of the early 2nd millennium as adopted into Hittite. Stage 7 is a simplified sign as written by Assyrian scribes in the early 1st millennium until the script's extinction. So that's the evolution, and our academics have made enormous errors by not picking up on the Reverend George Barton, and O'Brien has come in with his brilliant practical O'Brien as one of the world's leading exploration geologists, practical man, and sorted this issue out, but none of the academics want to listen. O'Brien describes here and says this: the settlement of the Anunnaki, which is his translation of the Anunnaki, which is well talked about by the academics. The settlement of the Anunnaki was indicated by the above ideograms, which had the phonetic value of Karsag or Karsag, and appears to mean either the principal fenced enclosure or the lofty fenced enclosure. Possibly both translations are valid. The Anunnaki were the Sumerian equivalents of the biblical angels. Only after they had disappeared from the Middle Eastern scene were they worshipped in a religious sense, and they were then so enveloped in supernatural trappings that their intrinsic, advanced and benevolent characteristics were swamped into a morass of pseudo-religious adulation. So there we are. We're living in a world now of pseudo-religious adulation because we've missed out the key points and facts about our ancestors and their benevolent history. O'Brien looked for this site, having looked at the books of Enoch and done an alternative translation of the Genesis text, which is on the Golden Age Project website. He produced this map here, which is from a French Ordnance Survey map, which is the environs of the Rishaya Basin. And that's page 314 of the Genius of the Few. And Mount Hermon is that bottom of the ground there, about 9,600 feet high. It's actually known as the Mountain of the Chief and Snowy Mountain in the Arab world. And Hermon is cognate with Haran, which means sacred. And the dots on this particular diagram are the havens below left, and they're recorded in the Chronicles of Enoch, which describe in detail Enoch's journey to meet the great Lord. This is chapter 4 of the Genius of the Few. So we have a detailed observation and wonderful account by Enoch of what he saw, which included the reservoir, included the great house, and meeting the great Lord. And he was first of all terrified because they were very tall and had this sunblock on their faces, so they did shine with reflective power. But they said, "Come on, Enoch, we'll take off your clothes and give you a good wash down," which they did, and anoint you with the oil. And he came out saying, "I look just like one of them, and all my fear and trembling left me." So you have here, A is the key lake bed, which was drained for the cereal crops and most of the important things that needed irrigation. And as we found later, where the water table could be controlled, which is a crucial aspect of farming. You have a northern basin, and you have the 3 other basins which could have been possible sites, but for various reasons they were all excluded in O'Brien's studies. And I'm going to do a little more on this a little bit later. There's a blow-up, a French Ordnance Survey again with the features identified by Christian O'Brien, and we have a great house, we have a reservoir, which we've been to look at and see, and the great water course. And he's put where he thought things were, and that's pretty much right. The perpetual snow of Mount Hermon, as seen from Mount Bentor in Israel across the Bekaa Rift Valley. Mount Hermon was called Senir by the Amorites, Sorion by the Sidonians, Baal Hermon by the Canaanites, and also Mount Sion or Sion in the Bible, in Arabic, Mountain of the Chief. Highest point is 2,814 meters, and this is on the other side of the Bekaa Valley, which is the Rift Valley running between those 2 mountain ranges. Remaining cedar grove, well watered by snow melt water. Very, very important. That snow resides till midsummer and gives a constant supply of spring water, and so that's one of the reasons this was in the place, and one of the only places where they could have grown crops. And it also registered too is the fact that this is the headwaters of the Jordan Valley, and eventually the Jordan Valley goes down to Jericho, where you have had a much warmer climate because it's 1,300 feet below sea level. And we're talking here about the Levantine corridor and why this was the most suitable place on the planet to restart agriculture and civilization after the great Younger Dryas Ice Age. And of course cedar trees get this snow melt, and they get the sun, and they get the protection here, and so it's always been the importance of Lebanon has been the cedar forests. Now this is in 2007 when Google first produced images from satellite, and I saw this and said, wow, there we are, there's our great watercourse, and that's proved to be true. And we made a site visit in 2009. We took a lot of photographs, some of which I'm going to show you now, and there's absolutely no doubt that that is the site of the original watercourse. And that's watercourse looking east back towards Mount Hermon and to the reservoir. And in this particular photograph, the basin, because the waterworks and everything waterworks is broken down, and the flood water is not diverted as it was originally down that watercourse to the Wadi Nerab, then you've got flooding when you've got peak snowmelt. And that's even better because that shows you more clearly the watercourse from a closer position. So this is what Genesis says, the Garden of Eden. And the Lord God planted a garden eastward in Eden, and there he put the man whom he had formed. And out of the ground made the Lord God to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. And a river went out of Eden to water the garden, from whence it was parted and became into 4 heads. The name of the first is Sion, the name of the second Gihon, the name of the third Hiddekel, and the fourth is the river is the Euphrates. Now, what I want you to look at are those bold figures, and a river, in fact, was a watercourse. They had not translated the cuneiform correctly when they put this material together in exile in Babylon, from whence it was parted, and that means sluices, and then became into 4 heads, irrigation channels. And so we got all the reasons why, looking for rivers that went out of Eden to water the garden. And then it's completely wrong. We've got to look at the practical issues, and then we get our solutions. And of course, we may well find that the channels, irrigation channels, did have names, as any farmer would put a name on them, and they may well have been used to give names to rivers much later. And we're looking here at the Hebraic translation in the Genesis at about 500 BC, when in fact we're looking at 9,000 years earlier, when this reservoir and this area was utilized to restart agriculture and civilization. As the eastern end of the watercourse, you can see 2 big banks of sand, which are the banks of the watercourse. They're currently being bulldozed and filled in to make small containers for water when it floods, and orchards where they push the sand and banks of the watercourse in. So this priceless, wonderful story of our ancestors as being savaged by people with bulldozers and building houses on the important sites, and that we're losing the heritage. Now, the good news is that the Association for the Protection of Lebanese Heritage have listed it as an area for protection, and we're working hard to get it protected, but we need your help, please. This is looking down to the level basin from the Great House. This is Enel's Great House, where Enoch went to meet the Great Lord. Above a hillside well, which you can see halfway up on the left-hand side just. Nobody knows how that manages to still work, and the locals say it always has water at the same level, regardless of conditions. And it was in the area where there would have been sites for livestock buildings and pastures and orchards and plantations. That is the site of the Great House, and that is in fact material largely which is being bulldozed to the edge of the house. And this is described as a great cedar-built house within the sanctuary, the lofty enclosure perched on the high rock, and that has a wonderful view over both the North Basin, South Basin, and all that's going on, and that's where we believe that Enel's Great House was built. Site of Enel's great cedar-built house and enclosure on the high rock. Various descriptions from the ancient texts are clear in providing the evidence. We're looking here at the Eker mountain house, where the gods lived and divine decrees were given, kingship was exercised, and from which the cosmic waters of fertility flowed. Descriptions of the great cedar-built house within the sanctuary, with the building of stone fireplaces, and where Adam and Eve spoke to the serpent, all help to support the O'Brien thesis that this is the site for the Garden of Eden. So it's a flat top hill overlooking North and South Shire basins, and it's got a very clear dog head there, which would have seen very well from the air. And the word serpent, the serpent in the garden, was a person, not a snake. The word serpent is an extremely old word with the roots in there of serve and S-A-R, S-A-R-V, etc. is about service, about medicine, about wise men and women understanding science. It's not snakes, and of course we get the reptilians and the snakes all coming in and distorting the original wonderful story. Now this is the issue. Oxford University have classified the secular tablets, translated by Christian O'Brien, as fragments or versions of Oxford University established myths. In their most basic form, all clearly have descriptions of the creation of an irrigated garden or agricultural settlement at the head of the valleys, and not incantations and hymns, as suggested by even the Reverend Professor George Barton in 1918, who understood cuneiform better than anybody else and translated part of the text reasonably accurately and gave them the name of the Karsag tablets. Some people call them Hersag, but Hersag comes as a separate subject outside the work of Professor George Barton. Now the Nipper Library cuneiform tablet numbers and descriptions below are held by the Museum of the University of Pennsylvania. So this is the most important view. You have a modern title, and that's to our Oxford academics who have filed them away, not understanding the translations. And it's the debate between sheep and grain, a Barton cylinder, Enil and Ninil, self-praise of Shulgi, Old Babylonian oracle, Kesh temple hymn, the debate between winter and summer, hymn to Emil, lament for Uyur. Now the museum numbers are beside them. Anybody can do this research, particularly if you live in America and in Pennsylvania. And I'm going to jump. Barton had the title as he was getting somewhere near it. He got first one, a creation myth, two, the oldest religious text from Babylonia, very important, the oldest religious text he regarded it. Enil and Ninil, well, they go all the way through, they're very clearly key people. A hymn to Dungi, an old Babylonian oracle, same as the modern title. Fragments of liturgy to Nimrod, a hymn to Ibi Sin, excerpt from exorcism, God knows how that got in there. A prayer to the city of Ur, that seems reasonable. But the O'Brien titles, properly translated, you have a very free-flowing and sensible approach, which first of all is the decision to settle, the arrival of the Anunnaki, the romance of Enil and Ninil, which doesn't take place on some kind of canal in Sumer, it takes place right here in Karsag. The planning the cultivation, building of the settlement, the great house of Enil, a cold winter storm, 1,000-year storm, and the final destruction of Karsag. And so you have, under the O'Brien titles, the realistic approach, and the academics have got gunged up, so to speak, and not understanding what this material is, and I've tried to explain the reasons for that. They start off learning about Akkadian, which is the wrong end of the stick. No hope of understanding cuneiform if you start with the most recent. Now Paul Bedson works for the Golden Age Project and with me, and he's done terrific work. He's been out there and surveyed the site with Carl Guilford. They've taken lots of photographs and looked at all the features and details, and both are totally convinced that O'Brien had got it spot on, because they could see on the ground what O'Brien was explaining from the records in the Bible, from Enoch and from the Sumerian records. And Paul Bedson has been doing a great deal of work on this subject, trying to get the academics to accept it, and feeding information to the Lebanese, who are being very helpful and naturally want to know much more about their own country. And this is Paul speaking. I did extensive work on Wikipedia with the Barton tablets. They aren't lost, just the content ignored. I created pages on every one. The problem is that the Barton tablets are now classified as fragments or versions of Oxford University established myths. Now, the importance of the establishment's myths, translated according to the religious bias standards by religiously biased institutions, has superseded the importance of differences in the tablets themselves. This is the problem with an academic establishment focused on categorizing and filing, rather than understanding the meaning of what they're categorizing and filing. The links to the pages about the tablets are below. When I wrote them, despite Wikipedia's encyclopedic requirements, I wanted to highlight their featuring Hersag, the Garden of the Gods, and any geographical or physical features of the location of the myths. Now, these are the references to Hersag or Karsag on Wikipedia. And the reason I'm going to relate each one of these is you will see that the so-called myths are describing all the things that we can see on that image of the basin. I read out the various features as we go through, and you'll see that the myths match the information that O'Brien provided. The only problem is we don't have any kind of willingness from the academic establishment to even talk about it. They dismissed it as myth, but we need for somebody sensible in the academic establishment to say, well, all these myths actually can be all placed in the Garden of Eden site below Mount Hermon. So I'm just going to go through them. You can do your own research on Wikipedia, and any contributions will be gratefully received. Now, Hersag is transcribed cuneiform, and whether it's Karsag or Hersag doesn't matter, but it's the same meaning. And it says here, is a Sumerian term variously translated as meaning mountain, hill, foothills, or Piedmont. Thorkild Jacobson, who is one of the great translators for whom I have tremendous respect, he extrapolated the translation in his later career to mean literally head of the valleys, which is precisely what that area is, and I'm going to just show you that later. Mountains play a key role in Mesopotamian mythology, and the Assyrio-Babylonian religion, they didn't even have a religion, it's a very important point, but never mind, associated with deities such as Anu, Enlil, Enki and Ninkarsag. So we've got all the same names referred to in what is called Assyrio-Babylonian religion. Some scholars also identify Hersag with an undefined mountain range or strip of raised land outside the plain of Mesopotamia. Well, this of course was 5,000 years before Mesopotamia could be populated because of all the melting ice, etc., and the fact that you would have had terrific floods, and it wouldn't have been suitable to do anything much in the land between the two rivers, which is what Mesopotamia means. And so they're all looking in the wrong place, all believing the Garden of Eden was in the Mesopotamian plains, going down to the Gulf. Now this is the Ninurta myth. Lurgali describes the abundance of Hersag. In a myth variously entitled by Samuel Noah Kramer, another great man, as the deeds and exploits of Ninurta. Now Ninurta in fact was the daughter of Ninkarsag, Enlil's wife Ninil, and she became governor of the Garden of Eden, and therefore she became known not as Ninil but as Ninkarsag, governor of the Garden of Eden. Back to total equality of women again. And later Ninurta myth Lurgali by Thorkild Jacobson, Hersag is described as a mound of stones constructed by Ninurta after his defeat, well, it was her defeat, of a demon called Asak. Well, they're so way out there it's ridiculous. And as I say, Ninurta's mother, Ninil, visits the location after his great victory. In return for her love and loyalty, Ninurta gives Ninil the Hersag as a gift. Well, that makes sense, doesn't it? You don't give somebody a pile of stones. Her name is consequently changed from Ninil to Ninhursag, or the mistress of Hersag. So you get part of the story. And of course, it's the fact that Ninil was made governor of the Garden of Eden and her name changed to Ninhursag. The Ninurta myth continued. The Hersag is described here in a clear cultural myth as a high wall, levee, dam or flood bank used to restrain the excess mountain waters and floods caused by the melting snow and spring rain. Exactly as I've described on that diagram of the Ordnance Survey map, etc., where there was a dam which Enoch talks about, and about 50 or 60 acres of deep water reservoir. The Hersag is constructed with Ninurta's skills in irrigation, engineering, and employed to improve the agriculture of the surrounding lands, farms and gardens where the water had previously been wasted. So this is getting closer to what we're talking about, but I think anybody with common sense can see the direct links between the myths and the real thing. Now this is a debate between sheep and grain. This is what it's described as. Another Sumerian creation myth, the debate between sheep and grain, opens with a location, and its location is the hill of heaven and earth, and describes various agricultural developments in a pastoral setting. This is discussed by Edward Guerra as not a poetical name for the earth, but a dwelling place of the gods, situated at the point where the heavens rest upon the earth. And it is there that mankind had their first habitat, and there the Babylonian Garden of Eden is to be placed. The Sumerian word Eden means steppe or plain, so modern scholarship has abandoned the use of the phrase Babylonian Garden of Eden, and it has become clear the Garden of Eden was a later concept. Slightly confusing. This is a list of additional supporting ancient texts. In the Kesh temple hymn, and remember the word temple always meant tamon, it was an administrative building. We didn't have temples, even the Greeks' buildings were administrative buildings as such, and they were called tamons. In the Kesh temple hymn, the first recorded description, right about 2600 BC, of a domain of the gods is a garden. The four corners of heaven became green for Enlil, like a garden. In an earlier translation of this myth by George Aaron Barton in Miscellaneous Babylonian Inscriptions, he considered it to read, "In Kersag, the garden of the gods were green." Getting close. And there's a hymn to Enlil. A hymn to Enlil praises the leader of the Sumerian pantheon in the following terms. You founded it in the Dur and Ki, in the middle of the four quarters of the earth. Its soil is the life of the land, and the life of all the foreign countries. Its brickwork is red gold, its foundation is lapis lazuli. You made it glisten on high. Little bits of clues there. Then we come to the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes Gilgamesh travelling to a wondrous garden of the gods that is the source of a river next to a mountain covered in cedars, and references a plant of life. In the myth, paradise is identified as the place where the deified Sumerian hero of the flood, or Zisudra, was taken by the gods to live forever. This is the story of eternal life. Once in the Garden of Gods, Gilgamesh finds all sorts of precious stones similar to Genesis. There was a garden of the gods. All round him stood bushes bearing gems, fruit of carnelian with vine hanging from it, beautiful to look at, lapis lazuli, leaves hung thick with fruit, sweet to see, rare stones, agate, pearls from out of the sea. In other versions of the Epic of Gilgamesh, it's clearly the Garden of the Gods, and he speaks to the keeper at the gate. He is accompanied by Enkidu, and Enkidu kills the giant Hawawa, whose job is to look after the cedar forests for the gods. Several connections here, all very clear that they're looking at the Garden of the Gods close to Mount Hermon in this, what I call the Levantine corridor. Another myth is called the Song of the Hoe. Features Enlil creating mankind with a hoe, and Anunnaki spreading outward from the original Garden of the Gods. It also mentions the Absu being built in Eridu. So there are more important clues. The Absu is now defined as underground water, or God's garden, and that's exactly what we have in the lake below Mount Hermon. We have a water table which is controlled over an acreage of 1,200 acres. And the cylinder seal here shows a very tall man holding a plough, something as simple as a plough. And academics didn't even recognize that as a plough. And this is cylinder seal VA243, which resides in the Berlin Museum, Enlil holding the plough. First thing you have to do when you go farming is to plough the ground. And we're going to show you a plough now. And this is a Nippur tablet at the bottom, dated to 4000 BC. And you can see here they're pulling a cedar plough, and they've got a spout on there where one man is dropping the seed in precisely the right distance apart, depending on the crop they were growing, and the man holding the plough, with the oxen behaving beautifully, is able to control the depth at which that seed goes into the soil. That's precision seeding. We now have very expensive machines to do the same job. So they were still getting the precision with this system here. And in the cylinder seal you can see there are 3 people involved, one looking after the oxen, one putting the seed down the spout, and the other holding the plough. The cuneiform tablet of the Artaharis epic, and that's in the British Museum. Sumerian paradise is described as a garden in the myth of Artaharis, where the lower ranked deities, the Igi, are put to work digging a watercourse by the more senior deities, the Anunnaki. When the gods, like man, bore the labour, carried the load, the gods' load was great, the toil grievous, the trouble excessive. The great Anunnaki, the 7, these were the 7 archangels, were making the Igi undertake the toil. The Igi then rebel against the dictatorship of Enlil, setting fire to their tools and surrounding Enlil's great house by night. On hearing that toil on the irrigation channel is the reason for the disquiet, the Anunnaki council decide to create man to carry out agricultural labour. Another similar story, which you've got digging a watercourse which was 1.5 miles through solid rock, very similar in dimension and size and scale to the rock-cut ditch around Jericho, which I describe elsewhere in other presentations. And this is a very important Ezekiel quote, a clue to the location of the Garden of Eden. Behold, the Assyrian was a cedar in Lebanon, with fair branches and with shadowing stroud, and of high stature, and his top was among the thick boughs. The waters made him great, the deep set him up on high, with her rivers running round his plants, and sent out her little rivers unto all the trees in the field. Therefore his height was exalted above all the trees in the field, and his boughs were multiplied, and his branches became long because of the multitude of waters when he shot forth. All the fowls of heaven made their nest in his boughs, and under his branches did all the beasts of the field bring forth their young, and under his shadow dwelt all great nations. Thus was he fair in his greatness, in the length of his branches, for his root was by great waters. The cedars in the garden of God could not hide him. The fir trees were not like his boughs. The old chestnut trees were not like his branches, nor any tree in the garden of God was like unto him in his beauty. I have made him fair by the multitude of his branches, so that all the trees of Eden that were in the garden of God envied him. This is from Ezekiel. And I said earlier, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the cedar forest was visited by Gilgamesh and Enkidu. And Enkidu is said to have killed the giant Hawawa, who guarded the cedars for the Anunnaki. Both spoke to the keeper of the gate at the entrance to the enclosure, the Garden of the Gods. Roman Emperor Hadrian brought in strict laws to protect the Lebanon cedars, and Queen Victoria donated large sums of money too for the preservation of the cedar trees in the Lebanon. Now this is an extract from the Bible. The Bible itself lends further credence to Israel or someplace nearby as the location of the Garden of Eden. Cedar trees are mentioned elsewhere in the Bible as references to Lebanon: Judges, Psalms, Song of Solomon, Jeremiah, Isaiah. In this passage the Bible says that the Assyrian was in Lebanon. And of course Assyria did cover Lebanon in those very early days. From this we can infer that the Garden of God and the source of the rivers of the garden was somewhere close to the land of Lebanon. More evidence, more clues. The Mount Hermon range, a wonderful photograph there with Mount Hermon above the clouds and the mist in the valley. There is a panoramic view across the Rishaya Basin, southern Lebanon, taken during our November 2009 visit and survey of the site of the Garden of Eden, and called Karsag by the Sumerians. A composite photograph by Carl Guilford. That's a fisheye lens, so what we've got is a flat basin, but it looks like it doesn't look flat there, but it is. Very important point on the clues as to where we now are at establishing a scientific evidence. This is an extract from the impact of radiocarbon dating of Old World archaeology, past achievements and future. Obar Joseph, Peabody Museum, Department of Anthropology, Harvard University, Cambridge, Massachusetts. And this, I'm just reading this extract. Second, there's a general agreement on the identification of the Younger Dryas, whether in marine sediments, lake cores, or spelethithams. And this is Wright, Rosignol, Strick, Hillman, Gordon Hillman, very important man, Landman, Barr Matthews, Lamp and Stern, Fondigo and Frumkin. The conditions prevailing during the Younger Dryas are crucial in interpreting the archaeological remains, and unfortunately the dating of this period in the Near East is not without difficulties. According to the ice cores, the Younger Dryas lasted from 12.9, and that's before present, thousand years, to 11.6, which is just over 9,500 years. While in the Vav sequence of Lake Van in eastern Turkey, this cold and dry period was longer by around 800 years. What this means is that if we're looking for the origins of agriculture, we mustn't go too far north, because there was an 800-year difference between Lake Van and Turkey and what we're talking about, which is Karsag and the Levantine corridor. This is the very latest research. We did originally believe there were 7 independent centres for agriculture. Now we have this diagram which shows 10 probable centres of origin, and I want you to look at Aswad, Jericho here, right in the middle of that, those black dots. And because of the work carried out by Obar Joseph, then we should be looking at Aswad and Jericho and Abu Mahdi in preference to those northern sites, because they were clearly much later, up to 400, 800 years later than the Aswad and Jericho sites, and the Levantine corridor runs from Aswad to Jericho. The flow from the Rishaya Basin, the Ahia Plain, which we looked at that basin and the Great Watercourse, that runs to the Hisbani River, and the Hisbani River is in red, and then it goes into the blue, and that is the headwaters of the Jordan. And the red, in fact, is an underground channel, which is the suspected route, and when the locals put dye down there, they found it came out in the Hesbani River. So they tracked that underground watercourse which drains the basin, particularly when it's been flooded, and we believe that the water table was controlled at a sluice at that point where that underground river runs through the karst limestone, which is the porous limestone. Many people are told quite erroneously by the dating which came from Cambridge, in fact Cambridge University dating of the Sumerians. It was completely wrong, and it had to be put right by Lieutenant Colonel L.A. Waddell, and the first earliest Sumerian king we have here reigns from 3378 to 3340. And remember, their timekeeping and astronomy was brilliant, and so we can rely on these dates to be pretty accurate. But that particular extract from L.A. Waddell makes the point that the first Sumerian king was 3378, and it was a confederation of the city-states, a very important point. When the kings began to realize they needed to meet in council and discuss their problems, when there were difficulties with one of the kings, they would appoint a king of kings, and in Sumer he was called a Shishak. So a king like Ramesses was given the title Shishak, and of course that everybody got confused. Who's this Shishak? But it was the title, and titles given in the ancient world has caused chaos amongst all the genealogies. In Greek it was Ozymandias, in Saxon it was Bradwald, in Britain with Jesus it was Pendragon. Jesus was the first Pendragon, King of Kings of the Britannic Isle, when he took the throne as the Hound of Bel, as it was, Cuno Bellinius. And as a postscript here, we move on, of course, to Baalbek, which comes later than the Garden of Eden site, and this is an Akkadian tablet some 4,000 years ago, states, "All we great Anunnaki," which is Anunnaki in the correct translation, "decided together on a rule. Anu, which is An, and Adad would rule the highlands, and I, Enil, would rule the lowlands." And so you have the lowlands from Karsag down to Jericho, and the highlands of the area around Baalbek. In this stanza, the highlands and the lowlands are relative terms. We know that Enil, the lord of the cultivation, ruled in Karsag, so that here the lowlands refer to that irrigated plain as distinct from the surrounding mountains. The highlands, therefore, were the higher parts of the Lebanon area. In these parts today there exist the magnificent ruins of Baalbek to remind us of the almost incredible achievements of gods and men in times so remote that the mind has difficulty in comprehending the span of it. These ruins comprise an architectural complex, the description of which includes such superlatives as having columns amongst the tallest ever constructed on earth, the largest stone blocks ever used for any purpose, and the boldest architectural engineering feat ever carried out in the ancient world. And that's from The Shining Ones by Christian and Barbara Joy Barn. And the columns of Baalbek were Aswan granite, the pink granite from Aswan, all the way from Egypt up to the mountains of Lebanon. And that is the end of this presentation. Thank you.